Welcome to Complete Histories. Tonight we begin Part 3, the early modern era, an age of exploration, invention, global encounters, and expanding horizons. If you'd like, share where you're tuning in from. Settle your mind, find a comfortable place to rest, and let's wander into the centuries that reshaped the world. The year is 1492. Christopher Columbus has just made landfall in the Caribbean, becoming the first European to reach the vast continents of the Americas and forever linking two worlds that had developed in complete isolation for thousands of years. The medieval world is ending, and the modern world is beginning. Welcome to the modern period, 3 centuries that would witness the birth of the modern world. This is when European explorers would map the globe, when scientists would unlock the secrets of the universe, and when revolutionary ideas about government and human rights would challenge the very foundations of civilization. This is the age when Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa while designing flying machines centuries ahead of their time. When Martin Luther shattered the unity of Christianity with 95 theses nailed to a church door. When Galileo pointed his telescope at the heavens and proved that Earth was not the center of the universe. From the Renaissance to the Reformation, from the scientific revolution to the Enlightenment, from the age of discovery to the democratic revolutions, this is how humanity emerged from the medieval world and created the foundations of our modern global civilization. The movement began in Florence, where wealthy merchant families like the Medici used their fortunes to patronize artists, scholars, and philosophers. The Medici family had built a vast banking empire by establishing branches across Europe and pioneering new financial techniques like letters of credit, which allowed merchants to trade without carrying dangerous amounts of gold across long distances. This innovation made them one of Europe's richest dynasties, allowing them to effectively rule Florence as unofficial princes while technically remaining private citizens. Cosimo de' Medici established the family's cultural legacy in the mid-15th century by founding Europe's first public library and commissioning magnificent palaces and churches throughout Florence. He collected ancient manuscripts, supported scholars translating Greek texts, and created an environment where humanist learning could flourish under his protection and patronage. Later, his grandson Lorenzo the Magnificent elevated Florence to even greater heights, transforming his court into a gathering place for the greatest minds of the age. Lorenzo patronized young artists like Michelangelo and Botticelli, wrote poetry himself, and created a cultural renaissance that would influence all of Europe through the genius he nurtured and supported. But the Renaissance wasn't just about recovering the past, it was about revolutionizing the present. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, who lived from 1452 to 1519, embodied the Renaissance ideal of the universal genius. Born the illegitimate son of a notary in the small town of Vinci, Leonardo became painter, sculptor, engineer, anatomist, and inventor, investigating everything from the flight of birds to the flow of water, filling thousands of pages with observations and designs centuries ahead of their time. Leonardo's Mona Lisa, painted between 1503 and 1519, revolutionized portraiture through its psychological depth and technical innovation. As his biographer Walter Isaacson notes, the way the smile flickers makes it a work of art and science, because Leonardo understood optics, the muscles of the lips, and how light strikes the eye. Leonardo pioneered a technique called sfumato, the subtle gradation of tones without harsh lines, that created an almost mysterious, lifelike quality in his paintings. Michelangelo Buonarroti, who lived from 1475 to 1564, was born into a minor noble family in the Tuscan countryside, but became the greatest sculptor of his age, pushing the boundaries of art to new heights. His David, completed in 1504, captured the moment of psychological tension before the biblical hero's battle with Goliath. Michelangelo declared that in every block of marble he saw a statue, and he had only to hew away the rough walls that imprisoned the lovely apparition. The Sistine Chapel ceiling, painted between 1508 and 1512, represented the summit of Renaissance achievement. Working alone on scaffolding 65 feet above the floor, Michelangelo created a visual theology that traced the story of creation, fall, and redemption across 5,000 square feet of frescoed surface. Raphael Sanzio, who lived from 1483 to 1520, was born in the small town of Urbino, but became the master of perfect harmony and grace in Renaissance art. His School of Athens, painted in the Vatican between 1509 and 1511, depicted the greatest philosophers of antiquity in a magnificent architectural setting, symbolizing the Renaissance marriage of classical wisdom and Christian faith. Raphael's ability to combine Leonardo's sfumato with Michelangelo's monumentality created a style of sublime beauty that influenced centuries of artists. Sandro Botticelli, who lived from 1445 to 1510, emerged from a humble artisan family in Florence to become the painter of mythological dreams and religious devotion. His Birth of Venus, completed around 1485, revived classical mythology as a subject for Christian art, depicting the Roman goddess emerging from the sea in a celebration of divine beauty. Under Medici patronage, Botticelli created works that captured the Renaissance spirit of combining pagan and Christian themes. Donatello, who lived from 1386 to 1466, revolutionized sculpture by returning to classical principles while developing new techniques. Born Donato di Niccolò in Florence, he created the first freestanding nude sculpture since antiquity with his bronze David around 1440. This groundbreaking work marked the Renaissance break from medieval artistic conventions and established sculpture as an independent art form capable of expressing both religious and secular themes. Meanwhile, in the Netherlands, Jan van Eyck pioneered oil painting techniques that would transform European art. His Ghent altarpiece, completed with his brother Hubert around 1432, demonstrated unprecedented realism through oil's ability to capture minute details and brilliant colors. Van Eyck's innovations spread throughout Europe, influencing Italian masters and establishing Northern Europe as a major center of Renaissance art. Filippo Brunelleschi was a goldsmith's son who became the father of Renaissance architecture through his revolutionary engineering. His dome for Florence Cathedral, completed in 1436, was the largest built since antiquity, and demonstrated how Renaissance artists combined classical inspiration with innovative techniques to achieve the seemingly impossible. The Renaissance also witnessed a scientific revolution that challenged medieval understanding of the natural world. Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press around 1440, revolutionizing the spread of knowledge by making books affordable and widely available. His printed Bible, completed around 1455, marked the beginning of the Information Age and enabled the rapid dissemination of Renaissance ideas across Europe. Political theory also underwent a renaissance under Niccolò Machiavelli, a Florentine diplomat who witnessed the brutal realities of power firsthand during Italy's wars. His book, The Prince, written in 1513, analyzed leadership with unprecedented realism. He wrote that it is much safer to be feared than loved, because love is preserved by the link of obligation, which owing to the baseness of men is broken at every opportunity for their advantage. But fear preserves you by a dread of punishment, which never fails. The humanist movement found its greatest advocate in Desiderius Erasmus, who lived from 1466 to 1536, a Dutch scholar who promoted educational reform and religious tolerance. His book, Praise of Folly, published in 1511, used satire to criticize both church corruption and human vanity, while his scholarly editions of classical and biblical texts established new standards for learning. Erasmus embodied the Renaissance ideal of using classical wisdom to improve Christian society. This insight into human nature would influence political thought for centuries. Think about the ordinary farmer who gives heavy taxes to a noble lord for nothing except protection. Without the elites, invaders could destroy their farms, so they live in fear of what might happen, choosing security over freedom. The Renaissance celebration of human potential and individual conscience set the stage for the most devastating split in Christian history. By 1500, the Catholic Church had accumulated enormous wealth and power, but many believers questioned whether it still represented Christ's teachings. The crisis erupted in Germany, where a young Augustinian monk named Martin Luther was tormented by questions of salvation. How could a sinful human being earn God's forgiveness? The Catholic Church taught that salvation came through good works, participation in sacraments like Mass and confession, and, increasingly, monetary payments called indulgences, which were supposed to reduce punishment for sins. The sale of indulgences reached scandalous proportions under Pope Leo X, who needed funds to complete the magnificent St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. To raise money, the church appointed Johann Tetzel, a Dominican friar, to tour Germany selling certificates that supposedly reduced time in purgatory, the place where souls were believed to suffer before entering heaven. His sales pitch was blunt. He proclaimed that as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Luther was outraged by what he saw as the commercialization of salvation. The church was essentially selling God's forgiveness to the highest bidder, while ordinary people emptied their purses believing they could buy their way out of spiritual punishment. On October 31st, 1517, Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg's castle church, a traditional way of announcing a scholarly debate. These propositions challenged the church's authority and questioned whether the Pope had any power to release souls from purgatory, especially in exchange for money. Thanks to the printing press, Luther's ideas spread like wildfire across Germany and beyond. His central insight was revolutionary. Salvation came through faith alone, by grace alone, through Scripture alone. Good works were a result of salvation, not a cause of it. This theological breakthrough gave birth to Protestantism, a new form of Christianity that protested against Catholic doctrine and practices. Pope Leo X initially dismissed Luther as a mere squabble among monks, but the movement soon spiraled beyond anyone's control. When Luther refused to recant at the Diet of Worms in 1521, declaring that here he stood and could do no other, God help him, he was declared an outlaw of the Holy Roman Empire. Protected by Frederick the Wise of Saxony, Luther translated the New Testament into German, making Scripture accessible to ordinary believers for the first time. Other reformers pushed even further. Huldrych Zwingli in Zurich stripped churches of images and reformed worship, while John Calvin in Geneva developed a systematic theology of predestination. The Reformation unleashed forces that tore Europe apart. The German Peasants' War from 1524 to 1525 saw over 100,000 deaths as social revolution merged with religious reform. The Schmalkaldic Wars pitted Protestant and Catholic princes in devastating conflicts that laid waste to much of Germany. The Schmalkaldic League was an alliance of Protestant German princes who banded together to defend themselves against the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who wanted to force them back to Catholicism. The religious wars culminated in the 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648. The war began when the Holy Roman Emperor attempted to impose Catholicism on the Protestant population of Bohemia. The Bohemians were people living in what is now the Czech Republic, and they were largely Protestant and rebelled against Catholic rule. Soon the conflict spread throughout Europe. The war was characterized by brutal sieges, bloody battles, and atrocities committed by both sides. At its height, it involved most of the major powers of Europe, including France, Spain, Sweden, and the Holy Roman Empire. It was fought along religious, political, and economic lines, with each side vying for dominance. The war finally ended in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, which established the principle of state sovereignty and religious tolerance. Under this treaty, rulers gained the right to determine their own territory's religion, ending the dream of a unified Catholic Europe under papal authority. The agreement recognized that states, not religious institutions, would be the primary actors in international relations. This treaty marked the end of medieval Christendom's unity and the beginning of the modern European state system, where political power trumped religious authority and nations could coexist despite different faiths. The Renaissance spirit of inquiry and the need for new trade routes to Asia drove European explorers to venture into uncharted waters. The Ottoman Empire's conquest of Constantinople in 1453 had effectively cut off European access to the traditional Silk Road trade routes, making spices and luxury goods from Asia increasingly expensive and difficult to obtain. This Ottoman control of the eastern Mediterranean and overland routes to Asia spurred the search for alternative sea paths to the wealth of the East. The age of exploration emerged as Portugal and Spain, two small kingdoms on Europe's Atlantic edge, transformed themselves into global superpowers through maritime expansion. These rival nations literally divided the unknown world between themselves through the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, with Portugal claiming territories east of an imaginary line and Spain claiming everything to the west. This agreement would shape the next 3 centuries as Portuguese and Spanish explorers, conquistadors, and colonizers established the first truly global empires. Prince Henry the Navigator, who lived from 1394 to 1460, was a Portuguese prince who never actually sailed on voyages of exploration, but earned his title by establishing a school of navigation and systematically organizing expeditions along the African coast. From his base at Sagres, Henry gathered the best map makers, navigators, and shipbuilders of Europe, sponsoring dozens of voyages that gradually pushed Portuguese knowledge of the Atlantic further south. Bartolomeu Dias, who lived from 1450 to 1500, was a Portuguese navigator who achieved what many thought impossible when he rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. Born into a family of navigators, Dias commanded an expedition that sailed further around Africa than any European before him, proving that a sea route to Asia was possible and opening the path for Portuguese expansion into the Indian Ocean. Vasco da Gama, who lived from the 1460s to 1524, completed what Dias had started, becoming the first European to reach India by sea. This Portuguese explorer's voyage from 1497 to 1499 established the sea route around Africa to Asia, breaking the Venetian and Ottoman monopoly on the spice trade and making Portugal enormously wealthy through its control of Indian Ocean commerce. Christopher Columbus, who lived from 1451 to 1506, was a Genoese navigator whose miscalculations about the size of the Earth led to one of history's most consequential discoveries. Convinced that he could reach Asia by sailing west, Columbus persuaded Queen Isabella of Castile to fund his expedition. On October 12, 1492, after weeks at sea, his lookout cried, "Tierra, tierra, land, land!" Columbus had reached the Bahamas in the Caribbean, which he named San Salvador, but he never set foot on the North American mainland where he is most celebrated today. Across 4 voyages, Columbus only explored Caribbean islands and parts of Central and South America, dying in 1506, still believing he had reached the East Indies. Amerigo Vespucci, who lived from 1454 to 1512, was an Italian navigator and cartographer who became the first European to recognize that the Americas were an entirely new continent separate from Asia. Through his voyages along the South American coast and, importantly, the North American coastline between 1499 and 1504, Vespucci provided detailed descriptions proving this was a separate landmass from Asia. The continents were named America in his honor by the German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller, recognizing that Vespucci, not Columbus, had truly discovered the New World continents. Ferdinand Magellan, who lived from 1480 to 1521, was a Portuguese explorer sailing for Spain who launched the first expedition to circumnavigate the globe. Though Magellan himself was killed in the Philippines in 1521, his expedition proved that the world's oceans were connected and that the Americas were indeed separate from Asia. His voyage through the strait at the southern tip of South America, now called the Strait of Magellan, opened a new route to the Pacific Ocean. But it was Columbus's Caribbean discovery that would inadvertently change the world forever. Meeting the Lucayan people, he was struck by their generosity and skill as farmers and fishermen. The implications were staggering. Within decades, Spanish conquistadors would topple the great American empires. Portuguese traders would establish posts from Brazil to Macau, and European diseases would devastate indigenous populations who had no immunity to Old World pathogens. Hernán Cortés, who lived from 1485 to 1547, was a Spanish conquistador who led the expedition that destroyed the Aztec Empire. In 1519, Cortés arrived on Aztec shores with fewer than 600 men, but superior military technology, guns, cannons, and horses that the Aztecs had never seen. The Aztecs initially greeted him with gifts of gold and silver, believing the Spaniards might be emissaries of the god Quetzalcoatl. Over several years, Cortés engaged in brutal battles with the Aztecs, aided by indigenous allies who were enemies of the Aztec Empire. After months of siege, Tenochtitlan fell in 1521. Francisco Pizarro followed Cortés's strategy in conquering the Inca Empire in Peru. This Spanish conquistador captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa in 1532 through treachery, demanding a room filled with gold as ransom before executing him anyway. Though vastly outnumbered, Pizarro's small force of conquistadors used superior weapons, horses, and political divisions within the Inca Empire to achieve victory and claim Peru's vast silver wealth for Spain. The biological impact was even more catastrophic than the military conquest. Europeans, having survived diseases like the bubonic plague and smallpox, had developed immunity to these diseases. When spread to native populations, these diseases killed millions who had no natural resistance. The Age of Discovery created the first truly global economy. Silver from the Americas funded European wars and fueled global trade networks. American crops like potatoes, maize, and tomatoes transformed Old World agriculture and supported massive population growth. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and peoples between the Old and New Worlds, reshaped life on every continent. As explorers were discovering new worlds, scientists were revolutionizing humanity's understanding of the universe itself. The scientific revolution challenged medieval ways of thinking and established the foundations of modern science. The revolution began with Nicholas Copernicus, who lived from 1473 to 1543, a Polish astronomer and mathematician who shattered the medieval worldview with a single revolutionary idea. His book, On the Revolutions of the Celestial Spheres, published in 1543, proposed that the Earth orbited the Sun, not the other way around. This heliocentric theory contradicted both common sense and church teaching, which placed Earth at the center of God's creation, but Copernicus supported his theory with careful mathematical calculations. Galileo Galilei, who lived from 1564 to 1642, was an Italian physicist and astronomer who provided the observational evidence needed to support Copernican theory. Born in Pisa, Galileo improved the newly invented telescope and turned it towards the heavens, discovering the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and the mountains on the moon. These observations proved that celestial bodies weren't perfect spheres, and that Earth wasn't the only world with moons. When Galileo published his findings in Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems in 1632, he was tried by the Roman Inquisition and forced to recant his views under threat of execution. Legend has it that after his trial, he muttered, "And yet it moves," referring to Earth's motion around the sun. Johannes Kepler, who lived from 1571 to 1630, was a German mathematician and astronomer who refined the heliocentric model by discovering that planets orbit the sun in ellipses, not perfect circles. Working as an assistant to the great observer Tycho Brahe, Kepler used precise astronomical data to formulate his 3 laws of planetary motion: which provided exact mathematical descriptions of how the solar system works. Andreas Vesalius, who lived from 1514 to 1564, was a Flemish anatomist who revolutionized medicine by conducting detailed dissections of human corpses, something that had been forbidden for over 1,000 years. His masterwork, On the Fabric of the Human Body, corrected hundreds of errors that had persisted since ancient times and established anatomy as a science based on direct observation rather than ancient authority. William Harvey, who lived from 1578 to 1657, was an English physician who discovered the circulation of blood, proving that the heart pumps blood through the body in a closed system. Through careful experiments and dissections, Harvey demonstrated that blood flows in a continuous circuit, overturning the ancient belief that blood was consumed by the body's organs and constantly regenerated by the liver. The revolution culminated with Isaac Newton, who lived from 1643 to 1727, an English mathematician and physicist whose book Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, unified terrestrial and celestial mechanics under universal laws. Newton's law of universal gravitation explained why apples fall and why planets orbit, demonstrating that the same forces govern motion throughout the universe. Newton also developed calculus, conducted groundbreaking experiments with light and optics, and formulated the 3 laws of motion that still bear his name. As he modestly wrote, if he had seen further, it was by standing on the shoulders of giants. The scientific revolution transformed human consciousness. No longer was the universe a closed, earth-centered system governed by mysterious forces. Instead, it was an open, infinite cosmos governed by mathematical laws that human reason could discover and understand. As religious wars devastated Europe, a new form of government emerged that promised order and stability: absolute monarchy. No ruler embodied this system more completely than Louis XIV of France, known as the Sun King, who would transform France into Europe's dominant power through sheer force of personality and political genius. Louis XIV, who lived from 1638 to 1715, became King of France at age 4 when his father died unexpectedly, but the real drama began when he assumed personal rule at 23. Determined never to experience the chaos and civil wars that had marked his childhood, Louis reportedly declared "L'État, c'est moi," which means "I am the state," summarizing his revolutionary approach to absolute rule, where the king's will became the only law that mattered. Louis moved his court to Versailles, a magnificent palace that became the ultimate symbol of absolute monarchy. With over 2,000 rooms and gardens stretching for miles, Versailles was designed to overwhelm visitors with royal power and grandeur. The palace's Hall of Mirrors, with its 17 mirror-clad arches reflecting light from the gardens, demonstrated French wealth and artistic achievement, while serving as a stage for the king's daily performances of majesty. At Versailles, Louis created an elaborate court culture that turned dangerous nobles into ornamental courtiers rather than independent power centers. Nobles competed desperately for the privilege of attending the king's morning routine or holding his shirt during dress ceremonies. This brilliant system neutered potential rivals while creating a glittering showcase of French culture that dazzled all of Europe. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who lived from 1619 to 1683, was Louis's finance minister who developed mercantilism, an economic system designed to maximize French wealth and power at the expense of rival nations. Colbert encouraged domestic manufacturing, imposed crushing tariffs on foreign goods, and established colonies to provide raw materials and captive markets for French products, turning economics into a weapon of state power. Under Louis XIV, France became Europe's undisputed cultural center. French became the language of diplomacy and high culture throughout Europe. French art, literature, fashion, and etiquette were slavishly copied in courts from Madrid to St. Petersburg, making France the arbiter of European taste and refinement. But Louis's ambitions sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted from 1701 to 1714. The war began when King Charles II of Spain died without heirs. Louis supported his grandson Philip as the rightful heir, hoping to unite French and Spanish power under Bourbon rule. A desperate coalition of Austria, Great Britain, the Dutch Republic, and other powers fought to prevent French domination of Europe in a war that raged across multiple continents. The war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which recognized Philip as King of Spain, but required him to renounce any claims to the French throne. The treaty established the balance of power principle that would govern European diplomacy for centuries, ensuring that no single nation could dominate the continent. Frederick the Great of Prussia, who lived from 1712 to 1786, copied and refined Louis's absolutist model, transforming Prussia from a minor German state into a major European power. This philosopher king combined Enlightenment ideals with ruthless military efficiency, creating a state where rational administration and disciplined armies made Prussia the most efficient military machine in Europe. Catherine the Great of Russia, who lived from 1729 to 1796, was a German princess who seized the Russian throne from her incompetent husband and ruled for 34 years as an enlightened despot. Catherine expanded Russian territory, corresponded with Voltaire, and attempted to modernize Russia while maintaining absolute control over her vast empire. The Habsburg emperors of Austria also embraced absolutism, ruling a diverse empire that stretched from the Netherlands to Hungary. Through careful diplomacy, strategic marriages, and military prowess, the Habsburgs maintained their position as one of Europe's great powers despite governing dozens of different ethnic groups and languages. This system brought stability after the religious wars, but also laid the foundation for future conflicts between increasingly powerful states, each armed with professional armies and centralized bureaucracies capable of mobilizing unprecedented resources for war. The Age of Discovery had revealed new continents and sea routes, but the period from 1600 to 1750 saw European powers establish permanent colonial empires that would reshape the world. This wasn't just exploration, it was the systematic creation of global economic networks centered on European capitals. Spain established the first global empire, controlling vast territories from the Philippines to Peru. The Spanish colonial system was built on extracting precious metals, especially silver from the mines of Potosi in Bolivia. This silver flowed to Europe and Asia, creating the first truly global currency and fueling worldwide trade. Portugal created a different model, establishing trading posts and coastal enclaves rather than large territorial empires. From Brazil to Macau, Portuguese traders connected distant markets while avoiding the costs of governing large populations. The Dutch Republic, despite its small size, became a major colonial power through innovative business practices. The Dutch East India Company, established in 1602, was the world's first multinational corporation, complete with shareholders, limited liability, and tradable stock. The company controlled the spice trade from Indonesia and established New Amsterdam, which later became New York in North America. England developed its colonial empire gradually, establishing permanent settlements in North America and gaining control of key trading posts in India. The English East India Company initially focused on trade, but gradually assumed political control over much of the Indian subcontinent. France established colonies in the Caribbean with sugar plantations and trading posts in India and Africa. French explorers like Samuel de Champlain and Jacques Marquette mapped the Great Lakes and Mississippi River, claiming vast territories for France. The Atlantic slave trade became the backbone of this global economy for over 3 centuries. European ships carried manufactured goods to Africa, where they were exchanged for enslaved people, who were then transported under horrific conditions to the Americas. The Middle Passage across the Atlantic killed an estimated 2 million Africans, while survivors faced brutal conditions on plantations producing sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. This triangular trade devastated African societies, with entire regions depopulated by slave raids. African kingdoms like Dahomey and Asante became dependent on the trade, while coastal societies were militarized to capture people from the interior. The prophets built cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and Newport, while financing the Industrial Revolution itself. Insurance companies, banks, and shipping firms all profited from human bondage, creating a web of complicity throughout European and American society. Colonial wealth transformed European cities into major commercial centers, while products like sugar, coffee, and tobacco became part of daily life. However, this expansion created intense competition among European powers. The 7 Years' War, which lasted from 1756 to 1763, has been called the First World War because it was fought simultaneously in Europe, North America, the Caribbean, India, and the Philippines, a truly global conflict over colonial dominance. As absolute monarchs concentrated political power and colonial empires generated unprecedented wealth, European intellectuals began to question traditional authorities and promote new ideas about reason, progress, and human rights. The Enlightenment, often called the Age of Reason, would provide the intellectual foundations for the modern world. The movement began with John Locke's essays Concerning Human Understanding and 2 treatises of government, both published in 1689. Locke argued that knowledge comes from experience rather than divine revelation, and that governments derive their authority from the consent of the governed. If rulers violate people's natural rights to life, liberty, and property, Locke argued, the people have the right to rebel. Voltaire, whose real name was François-Marie Arouet and who lived from 1694 to 1778, became the Enlightenment's most famous advocate for religious tolerance and freedom of speech. After being imprisoned in the Bastille and exiled to England, Voltaire returned to France with admiration for English political and religious freedoms. He supposedly declared that while he disapproved of what someone might say, he would defend to the death their right to say it. Baron de Montesquieu analyzed different forms of government in The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, arguing that the best governments separate executive, legislative, and judicial powers to prevent tyranny. This idea of checks and balances would profoundly influence the American Constitution. Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert edited the Encyclopédie from 1751 to 1772, a massive work that attempted to catalogue all human knowledge. The Encyclopédie spread Enlightenment ideas throughout Europe and challenged traditional authorities by promoting reason and scientific knowledge over religious dogma. Jean-Jacques Rousseau offered a more radical critique of existing society in The Social Contract. Rousseau wrote that man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains, arguing that legitimate government must be based on the general will of the people. His ideas about popular sovereignty would inspire the French Revolution. Adam Smith revolutionized economic thought with The Wealth of Nations. Smith argued that free markets, guided by an invisible hand, would produce greater prosperity than government regulation. His defense of capitalism and free trade became the foundation of modern economics. Cesare Beccaria challenged brutal criminal justice systems in On Crimes and Punishments, published in 1764, arguing against torture and capital punishment. Mary Wollstonecraft extended Enlightenment principles to women's rights in A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, published in 1792, arguing that women deserved equal education and opportunities. The Enlightenment wasn't just about political theory. It promoted scientific and rational approaches to all aspects of life. Enlightenment thinkers believed in progress, arguing that human reason could solve social problems and improve living conditions for everyone. These ideas spread through coffeehouses, salons, and Masonic lodges throughout Europe and the Americas. By the 1770s, educated people on both sides of the Atlantic were discussing natural rights, religious tolerance, and representative government. The stage was set for revolutionary changes that would transform the world. While Europeans were establishing global colonial empires, powerful Asian civilizations were experiencing their own periods of expansion and decline. The Ottoman Empire, Mughal Empire in India, the Qing dynasty in China, and Tokugawa Japan all reached their peaks during this period before facing new challenges from European expansion. The Ottoman Empire reached its golden age under Suleiman the Magnificent, who lived from 1494 to 1566 and ruled from 1520 to 1566, when the empire controlled territories from Hungary to Yemen, from Algeria to the Persian Gulf. Known as Kanuni, meaning the lawgiver, to his own people, Suleiman reformed the Ottoman legal system, patronized magnificent architecture including the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, and transformed the empire into a major naval power in both the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. His reign marked the height of Ottoman military prowess, with Janissary infantry and powerful artillery that made Ottoman armies the most feared in Europe and Asia. Ottoman forces besieged Vienna in 1529 and again in 1683, threatening the heart of Christian Europe. The Ottomans also conquered much of the Middle East from their Persian rivals and established dominance over the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, making the Ottoman Sultan the protector of Islam's most sacred sites. But Ottoman expansion slowed after the failed siege of Vienna in 1683, and the empire began to fall behind European powers in military technology and administrative efficiency, gradually earning the nickname the sick man of Europe as it began to lose territories to Austria and Russia. The Mughal Empire in India was founded by Babur, a descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan, who conquered the Delhi Sultanate at the Battle of Panipat in 1526. Timur, also known as Tamerlane, was a 14th century Central Asian conqueror who had built a vast empire stretching from Turkey to India through brutal military campaigns. This Central Asian prince combined Mongol military tactics with gunpowder weapons to establish a dynasty that would dominate the Indian subcontinent, a region that today includes India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, for over 2 centuries. The empire reached its zenith under Akbar the Great, who ruled from 1556 to 1605. He created a syncretic culture that blended Indian Hindu traditions, Persian art and literature, and Islamic governance. Akbar established a revolutionary policy of religious tolerance in the diverse Indian subcontinent, marrying Hindu princesses and incorporating Hindu nobles into his administration, while encouraging philosophical debates between different faiths at his court. Shah Jahan, who ruled from 1628 to 1658, elevated Mughal art and architecture to unprecedented heights. He built the Taj Mahal in the Indian city of Agra as a tomb for his beloved wife Mumtaz Mahal. Its white marble dome and intricate inlay work demonstrated the sophistication of Mughal craftsmanship and the empire's vast wealth drawn from India's fertile lands and thriving trade networks. But the empire began to decline under Aurangzeb, who ruled from 1658 to 1707. He abandoned his predecessor's religious tolerance, instead imposing strict Islamic law throughout his domains. His persecution of Hindus and Sikhs sparked widespread rebellions across the Indian subcontinent, while his constant warfare to expand into the Deccan Plateau drained the imperial treasury and weakened central control. In China, the Ming dynasty fell to the Manchus in 1644, establishing the Qing dynasty that would rule until 1912. The Manchus were skilled administrators from Manchuria, northeast of China, who adopted Chinese governmental systems while maintaining their distinct cultural identity and forcing Chinese men to wear the Manchu queue hairstyle as a sign of submission. Emperor Kangxi ruled from 1661 to 1722, expanded the Qing Empire to its greatest territorial extent, controlling Tibet, Xinjiang, and Mongolia. Under his reign and that of his grandson, Emperor Qianlong, the Chinese population doubled, reaching 300 million by 1750, making China the world's most populous and prosperous empire. China maintained its traditional isolation from foreign influence as a matter of imperial policy, believing Chinese civilization was the Middle Kingdom, the center of the civilized world, and that all other nations were barbarian tributaries. The Chinese viewed their empire as culturally and technologically superior to all others, seeing no need for foreign goods or ideas. The Qing restricted European merchants to the single port of Canton and required all trade to go through Chinese intermediaries, reflecting their view that foreign goods were inferior luxuries rather than necessities. In Japan, the Tokugawa shogunate, which lasted from 1603 to 1868, brought political stability after centuries of civil war through a unique system where the Tokugawa family held supreme power as military dictators called shoguns, while the emperor remained a ceremonial figurehead in Kyoto. The shogun was the true ruler of Japan, commanding the loyalty of the samurai warrior class and controlling the country's feudal lords called daimyo. The Tokugawa imposed a rigid social hierarchy with samurai warriors at the top, followed by farmers who were honored for feeding the nation, then artisans who made useful goods, and finally merchants who were considered the lowest class despite often being wealthy. Most remarkably, Japan cut itself off from the outside world through a policy called sakoku, forbidding Japanese from leaving the country and expelling all foreigners except for a small Dutch trading post. This created a unique, isolated civilization that developed its own distinctive art, literature, and culture for over 2 centuries until American pressure forced Japan to reopen in the 1850s. The Enlightenment's ideas about natural rights and representative government found their first practical application in the 13 American colonies. What began as a dispute over taxation became a revolution that established the world's first modern democracy and inspired liberation movements worldwide. The conflict emerged from Britain's attempts to tax the American colonies to pay for the 7 Years' War. The Stamp Act of 1765, Tea Act of 1773, and other measures provoked colonial resistance based on the principle of no taxation without representation. Americans argued they couldn't be taxed by a parliament in which they had no voice. The Boston Tea Party in 1773 escalated the conflict when colonists dressed as Indians dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor to protest the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America. Parliament responded with the Coercive Acts in 1774, which colonists called the Intolerable Acts. The First Continental Congress in 1774 brought together representatives from 12 colonies to coordinate resistance. When fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, the American Revolution had begun. The Second Continental Congress faced a momentous decision: reconciliation with Britain or independence. Thomas Paine, who lived from 1737 to 1809, was an English-born pamphleteer whose book Common Sense, published in 1776, argued powerfully for American independence. Paine called King George III a royal brute and attacked monarchy itself as an absurd form of government, helping convince colonists that reconciliation with Britain was impossible. Thomas Jefferson, who lived from 1743 to 1826, was a Virginia planter and philosopher who became the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress approved Jefferson's document, which proclaimed revolutionary principles. It declared that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. George Washington, who lived from 1732 to 1799, was a Virginia planter who became Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army and proved that leadership could triumph over superior resources. British forces were professional soldiers supported by the world's most powerful navy, while American forces were largely militia with little training and inconsistent supplies. Washington's greatest achievement was keeping the Continental Army together through defeats, retreats, and the bitter winter at Valley Forge from 1777 to 1778. The turning point came with the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, where American forces surrounded and captured an entire British army under General Burgoyne. This victory convinced France to join the war as an American ally, providing crucial naval support and supplies. The war's climax came at Yorktown in 1781, where Washington and French General Rochambeau trapped British forces under General Cornwallis. When the French Navy defeated the British fleet offshore, Cornwallis had no escape route. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered, effectively ending the war. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 recognized American independence and granted the new nation territory extending to the Mississippi River. But winning independence was only the beginning. Americans now had to create a government that could hold 13 diverse states together. The Articles of Confederation proved inadequate, creating a central government too weak to tax, regulate trade, or maintain order. Shays' Rebellion from 1786 to 1787 demonstrated the need for stronger national authority. The Constitutional Convention in 1787 created an entirely new form of government. Rather than democracy, which ancient philosophers had condemned as mob rule, the founders created a republic with separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. The Constitution established a system where power was divided between federal and state governments and among executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The Constitution addressed Plato's ancient criticism of democracy by creating the Electoral College, where educated elites would choose the president rather than direct popular vote. This system reflected the founders' belief that pure democracy was dangerous, but that representative government based on popular consent was both practical and just. The American Revolution proved that Enlightenment ideas could work in practice. A colonial rebellion had become a successful experiment in self-government that would inspire democratic movements worldwide. The American Revolution's success inspired French intellectuals and reformers, but France's attempt at revolutionary change would prove far more radical and violent. The French Revolution began with hopes for constitutional monarchy, but ended with dictatorship, war, and the terror. King Louis XVI, who lived from 1754 to 1793, was a well-meaning but indecisive monarch who inherited France's severe financial crisis in the 1780s. Years of warfare, including support for the American Revolution, had bankrupted the royal treasury. Facing this crisis, Louis called the Estates General in 1789, the first time since 1614, hoping to find a solution, but instead unleashing forces that would destroy the monarchy and cost him his life. The Estates General traditionally represented three orders: clergy, nobility, and commoners. But the Third Estate demanded equal representation and voting by head rather than by order. When locked out of their meeting hall, Third Estate delegates gathered at a tennis court and swore the tennis court oath, vowing to create a new constitution for France. The Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly and began drafting the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in 1789, proclaiming that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Meanwhile, the economic crisis and rumors of royal plots sparked popular uprisings in Paris. On July 14, 1789, Parisian crowds stormed the Bastille fortress, a symbol of royal tyranny. The fall of the Bastille became the revolution's symbolic beginning and is still celebrated as France's national holiday. The National Assembly abolished feudalism and adopted the Declaration of Rights, initially following the American model toward constitutional monarchy. Marie Antoinette, who lived from 1755 to 1793, was the Austrian-born queen who became a symbol of royal excess and indifference to popular suffering. Though she probably never said, "Let them eat cake" to starving peasants, this alleged quote captured popular anger at royal privilege during France's economic crisis. War with Austria and Prussia beginning in 1792 created a crisis atmosphere that empowered radical revolutionaries. The monarchy was overthrown, King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were executed, and France was declared a republic. The revolution entered its most radical phase as external threats and internal opposition convinced revolutionaries that extreme measures were necessary for survival. Maximilien Robespierre was a lawyer from northern France, who became the revolution's most influential radical leader and architect of the Terror. Known as the Incorruptible for his moral rigidity, Robespierre believed that virtue required the elimination of the revolution's enemies. Leading the Committee of Public Safety, he proclaimed a cult of reason to replace Christianity and attempted to create a republic of virtue through revolutionary violence. The Reign of Terror from 1793 to 1794 saw thousands executed by guillotine, including many revolutionaries who were deemed insufficiently radical. But the Terror eventually consumed its own leaders. On July 28, 1794, Robespierre himself was executed, ending the Terror. The revolution then entered a more moderate phase under the Directory from 1795 to 1799, a 5-member executive council that attempted to stabilize France after the chaos of the Terror. The Directory's failures created an opportunity for an ambitious young general named Napoleon Bonaparte, who lived from 1769 to 1821. On November 9, 1799, Napoleon overthrew the Directory in a coup d'état and established the consulate with himself as first consul. Napoleon's rise marked the end of the French Revolution and the beginning of a new phase of European history. Unlike the chaotic revolutionary governments that preceded him, Napoleon offered order, efficiency, and military glory. He also consolidated many of the revolution's gains: legal equality, religious tolerance, and merit-based advancement, though abandoning its democratic ideals. Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French in 1804, creating a new form of monarchy that combined revolutionary legitimacy with imperial grandeur. Pope Pius VII attended the coronation, but Napoleon famously placed the crown on his own head, symbolizing that his authority came from his own achievements rather than divine appointment. His military genius transformed European warfare as his Grande Armée combined speed, flexibility, and concentrated firepower to defeat the traditional armies of Europe's old regimes. The Battle of Austerlitz in 1805 demonstrated Napoleon's tactical brilliance, as he defeated a combined Austrian and Russian army despite being outnumbered. At its height, Napoleon's empire stretched from Spain to Poland, from Hamburg to Naples. French armies carried revolutionary ideals across Europe, abolishing feudalism, establishing civil equality, and promoting nationalism. The Napoleonic Code, established in 1804, became one of history's most influential legal documents, establishing principles of legal equality, property rights, and secular law that spread throughout Europe and beyond. Napoleon later reflected that his true glory was not winning 40 battles, because Waterloo would erase the memory of so many victories. But what nothing would destroy, what would live eternally, was his civil code. But Napoleon's ambitions ultimately proved his undoing. The invasion of Russia in 1812 began with 600,000 men, the largest army ever assembled to that point. Moscow's capture seemed to promise victory, but the Russians had abandoned and burned their ancient capital. As winter approached, Napoleon was forced to retreat across the frozen Russian steppes. Disease, starvation, and constant harassment by Russian forces decimated the Grande Armée, and only 30,000 men returned to Germany. The Russian disaster encouraged Napoleon's enemies to form the Sixth Coalition. At the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, known as the Battle of the Nations, Allied forces decisively defeated Napoleon. Allied armies marched on Paris, and Napoleon was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba. But in March 1815, he escaped and returned to France for the famous 100 Days. French soldiers sent to arrest him instead rallied to his banner. Europe mobilized once more, and the final confrontation came at Waterloo in Belgium on June 18, 1815. The Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army and Blucher's Prussian forces combined to defeat Napoleon decisively. Wellington later called it the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life. Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821. The Congress of Vienna from 1814 to 1815 redrew Europe's map, and established a balance of power system designed to prevent any single nation from dominating the continent. The concert of Europe would maintain relative peace for nearly a century. For over 3 centuries, Spain had ruled a vast empire stretching from California to Chile, extracting enormous wealth from silver mines and plantations worked by indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. Spanish colonial society was rigidly hierarchical, with peninsulares, people born in Spain, holding the highest positions, followed by Creoles, people of European descent born in the Americas. Despite being wealthy landowners, merchants, and professionals, Creoles were excluded from top government positions and restricted in trade, creating growing resentment against Spanish rule. Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808 created a power vacuum that gave Creoles their long-awaited opportunity. When the Spanish king was imprisoned and Spanish authority collapsed, colonial elites across the Americas faced a choice: remain loyal to an uncertain Spanish government or seize independence for themselves. In Venezuela, Francisco de Miranda and then Simón Bolívar, who lived from 1783 to 1830, led the independence struggle. Bolívar, known as El Libertador, became the George Washington of South America with a revolutionary vision that extended beyond Venezuelan independence to the liberation of all Spanish America. After early defeats forced him into exile, Bolívar returned to lead military campaigns between 1810 and 1825 that freed Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, which was named in his honor. The Battle of Boyacá in 1819 secured Colombian independence, while the Battle of Carabobo in 1821 completed Venezuela's liberation. In the south, José de San Martín, who lived from 1778 to 1850, pursued a different strategy from his base in Argentina. Rather than fighting the Spanish directly, he crossed the Andes with his Army of the Andes, an epic march comparable to Hannibal's crossing of the Alps. The Battle of Chacabuco in 1817 liberated Chile, while the capture of Lima in 1821 struck at the heart of Spanish power in South America. Mexico's independence struggle was more complex, beginning with popular uprisings led by priests Miguel Hidalgo, who lived from 1753 to 1811, and José María Morelos, who lived from 1765 to 1815. These early movements combined independence with social revolution, frightening conservative Creoles who feared losing their privileged position. Only when liberal revolution in Spain threatened conservative interests did Mexican elites support independence under Agustín de Iturbide in 1821. Brazil achieved independence more peacefully under unique circumstances. When Napoleon's armies approached Lisbon in 1807, the Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil, transforming the colony into the seat of the Portuguese Empire. When King João VI returned to Portugal in 1821, he left his son Pedro, who lived from 1798 to 1834, as regent. Faced with Portuguese attempts to reduce Brazil's status back to a mere colony, Pedro declared independence in 1822, becoming Emperor Pedro I of Brazil. By 1825, only Cuba and Puerto Rico remained under Spanish control in the Americas. The new republics faced enormous challenges: political instability, economic disruption, and social divisions between different racial and ethnic groups. But the principle of national self-determination had triumphed throughout most of the Western Hemisphere. By 1800, the world had been fundamentally transformed. The early modern period had begun with isolated civilizations developing separately across the globe. It ended with continents connected by trade, ideas flowing across oceans, and the principle of human liberation spreading from North America to South America to Europe and beyond. The Renaissance had rediscovered human potential, the Reformation had challenged religious authority, and the scientific revolution had revealed the laws of nature. The Enlightenment proclaimed that all people possessed natural rights, and democratic revolutions proved these ideas could work in practice. From the 13 American colonies to the vast territories of Spanish America, people had shown that they could govern themselves and throw off imperial control. The foundations of the modern world were now in place. Democratic government, individual rights, scientific method, global commerce, and the revolutionary idea that ordinary people could shape their own fate. Join us in the final video as we witness humanity's most dramatic transformation, the Industrial Revolution that would give us the power to reshape the planet itself.